Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Liturgy of the Chalice. Today we continue our discussion of the Gospel of Mark. This is part 19 of a series. So now we come towards the conclusion of the Gospel of Mark, and we see Jesus, Mar Yeshua, entering the city of Jerusalem. From a historical perspective, again, there's ideas of legend about Jesus, and then there's the probable history about Jesus. And we're going to get into both of those today, briefly. The historical Jesus preached throughout the land. We've already seen in the earlier parts of the Gospel of Mark that Jesus preached and he drew large crowds to himself. But also he drew animosity towards himself. There were certain aspects of society that did not want Jesus to be teaching. In every age, in every religion, there comes a time when that religion must evolve. And there are two reasons why a religion must evolve. Number one, it needs to evolve with the times and the sensibilities of that time in order for it to make sense and be relevant to the people living at that time. Number two, some religions fall into a state of corruption where the people that run that religion, so to speak, the priesthood or the powers that be, the board of directors, these very special people start to make the religion profitable for themselves. Or people desire certain priests and certain leadership of different churches and also different religions, not just Christianity, to be fair. They have this authoritarian streak where they want to control people. They want to make people in their image rather than in God's image. They want them to follow their rules instead of God's rules. In fact, that's the whole reason why this Church of St. Philip exists. We represent an attempt, an uphill battle to eradicate corruption and untruth from Orthodox Christianity. The Catholic Church tried to kill us a couple, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, but they didn't kill all of us. Some of us are still here. So we come to show the probable historical teachings of Jesus and to separate that from legend and untruth. So we're getting rid of corruption. We're also showing that the priest doesn't run everything. Here, when you do the Liturgy of the Chalice, everybody does the chalice work together. It is the congregation that blesses not only that church, but the whole world with sacred vibrations of the liturgy. Liturgy means the people's work, not the priest's work. Yes, it does take an ordained priest or a consecrated bishop to consecrate the elements. However, the whole congregation does the blessing and sends out the vibration of peace to the whole planet. So Jesus himself saw a lot of corruption in the Pharisees, and when he taught, as you read not only the Gospel of Mark, but the other canonical Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, you see that he runs into a lot of tension with different Pharisaical groups and the Sadducees. And these two groups, the Sadducees in particular, were really heavily in charge of the Second Temple management. They were the temple establishment. And the Pharisees also worked within the Second Temple and around it. And together, the Pharisees and the Sadducees would teach in such a way that people couldn't even fulfill their so-called obligations to God. So Jesus found that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were falling into corruption. And he wanted to establish, through his prophetic mission, he wanted to re-establish the covenant of God. He didn't want to make a new religion. He wanted to renew the covenant with God. This relationship between God and God's children. So Jesus, even though he drew large crowds, as we see constantly being said throughout the earlier parts of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus wanted to go to Jerusalem for a reason. He wanted to address the temple establishment. He wanted to address the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He wanted to confront them with logic and reasoning and with sensible teachings. So in this segment over this week and next week, you'll see Jesus coming into Jerusalem, and he enters Jerusalem specifically at nightfall, because it says that after he entered Jerusalem on the colt, the donkey, that he went to the temple, but it was nighttime and nobody was there. So it says in the Gospel of Mark that he looked around at night and nobody was there, and he left. And then he came back the following morning when there would be people, priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, pilgrims, devotees of Yahweh. He wanted to be seen. So Jesus wasn't coming to the second temple. He wasn't entering Jerusalem to come and pray at the temple. He was coming in an attempt to convert more people to this renewed covenant of God, to his halakha, his teachings, which he felt encapsulated the teaching of Torah in a way that could be expressed by the people of his time. And amazingly so, even over 2,000 years later, his teachings are amazingly succinct and appropriate for this age. So Mar Yeshua is rather timeless. Let's jump into the gospel accounts. The colt and entry to Jerusalem. Mark 11:1 through 8. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say to this, 'The Lord needs it and will send it back here immediately.'" They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. So here Jesus is aware that some of his disciples, he knew that some of his disciples had a baby donkey. He was in communication with them. Jesus traveled throughout this area, as did his disciples, to preach his basor, his proclamation, the good news, the gospel. These words are all similar in meaning. So I don't think that this was necessarily mystical, although great masters definitely developed psychic type skills, and Jesus definitely did have foreknowledge. I don't think that this necessarily had to be some sort of mystical foreknowledge that he knew there would be a baby colt tied there. You know, families of certain types would breed donkeys to sell them. It would be a business. So perhaps Jesus knew that some of his disciples were breeding some donkeys, colts. Colt is the name of a donkey. Foal is the name of its baby. So he wanted a new donkey that had never been used before. It's very traditional in many religions to offer the master something that has not been used before. It's not considered couth to give them something that's already been used by yourself. So he wanted an unridden donkey. So he sent his disciples ahead of him to get a donkey for him to ride on. And when they were untying it, of course the people would think, why are you stealing my donkey? And they said, oh, it's for the Master Jesus. And they're like, oh, of course the Master can have this. So Jesus already probably knew this family that had some donkeys. If you need to make it into something mystical, you can. But I don't believe this necessary is some sort of divine vision that Jesus had. Perhaps it was, but I don't think that it need be. But anyhow, it's very important before we get into the next verses to know that donkeys were a very common way of traveling around Jerusalem, throughout Israel. They were used as pack animals to carry supplies, to carry merchandise from city to city. They were very common. Many people would be riding on donkeys. So Jesus always traveled around on foot with his entourage of disciples and followers, admirers, etc. So, of course, it would get tiring and he would occasionally be riding on a donkey, perhaps a camel at times. But it seems in this occasion that Jesus may have traveled to Jerusalem on a donkey. He may have. We don't know. This could be historical or non-historical. The reason why I say it could be non-historical is because of the following verses, what they make it out to be. So before we dive deeper into this idea of riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and what the gospel writers were trying to insinuate, let's discuss this next part. Did the people think Jesus was the Davidic Messiah? So you see Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, and he was very popular, so it's quite possible that many crowds saw him. And some of his disciples would go ahead and say, the Master Jesus is coming. The great prophet Jesus is coming. So many people would line up in the streets, in the entryway, to see this great prophet. Whether they knew him, wanted to know him, or abhorred him, they all would want to come there and see his entry. So let's look at Mark 11, 9 through 10. He's entering. They're laying their cloaks in the street. They're laying leafy plants from the fields, presumably palms, down on the road as kind of a red carpet to come in, as a way to honor him as a great prophet and master of Jerusalem. In Mark 11, 9 through 10, it says, then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor, David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. Is this historical? I believe this could actually be very historical. What we have to understand, as we've said in many other classes and in many other talks, is that the people of Jerusalem, the Judean people, had a messianic expectation that a son of David, someone of the lineage of David, would come and be the Messiah, the anointed one, that would throw out all the Romans, probably topple the Herodian government, the Herodian royalty, because they were just in bed with the Roman governance, and establish Israel as its own sovereign state with God as the supreme king. So many people may have thought that Jesus was this coming Messiah. But Jesus did not believe that he was the Davidic Messiah. And we'll show that in this presentation. Jesus did not self-identify as the Davidic Messiah. It's possible that Jesus was of the lineage of David, but even if he was of the lineage of David, meaning his ancestry was Davidic, that does not mean that he believed in the Davidic Messiah or that he thought he was the Davidic Messiah. But what we have to understand is that the people in Jerusalem, the people of Judea, their main messianic expectation was the Davidic Messiah. Jesus, as we know, did not preach the Davidic Messiah. He preached the Son of Man Messiah, which was taught in the school of Isaiah. It was presented in the book of Daniel, in the intertestamental literature of Enoch. These three main sources are where Jesus developed his messianic expectation, which was the Bar Anash, the Son of Mankind collective Messiah, that each human would purify his or her heart and become eligible to join this anointed second Adam. This new humanity, characterized by spirituality, selflessness, pure love, pure consciousness. That's what Jesus taught. But different areas, again, expected different types of messiahs. The Jews expected many different messiahs, and some people expected no messiah. And some people expected that multiple messiahs would come at different times, which is probably the truth. But needless to say, Jesus himself did not believe in the Davidic Messiah. Orthodox Christians will use this phrase to prove that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, that Paul in his letters claimed him to be. But Jesus did not believe he was the Davidic Messiah, and we'll come to that soon. So why did the Gospel of Mark and other Gospels stress that Jesus entered into Jerusalem on a donkey? They wanted this to be a proof that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah. This riding into Jerusalem on a donkey was meant to fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah. In Zechariah 9:9 we see, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The prophecies of Zechariah were about a coming, unnamed Davidic Messiah in a future time. And here, in this part of chapter 11 of the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus seeming to consciously fulfill that prophecy that he was the Davidic Messiah. And we have to understand this part as legend. Even though Jesus, like hundreds of thousands of other people, would be riding around Jerusalem on a donkey, he probably did ride into Jerusalem on a donkey or ride donkeys from this city to that city. But he did not ride a donkey to fulfill the fact or to reveal to the population that he was the Davidic Messiah. However, if you wanted to try and see this in a historical light, as a historical possibility, people seeing Jesus riding in on a donkey, faithful Jews that had heard the Zechariah prophecy that you see here on the screen, if they thought that Jesus was the Messiah, they may have seen this as proof themselves, and that could be why they're lauding him as blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. So it's possible that faithful Jews that knew of the prophecy of Zechariah, and they think that Jesus is the Messiah, and their definition of the Messiah is the King David. They see him entering on a donkey, they see that as fulfilling prophecy. So people seeing this may have misconstrued or misunderstood Jesus as the Davidic Messiah. But Jesus' inner circle of apostles and his closest disciples would be well aware of his halakha, that Jesus did not support a Davidic Messiah. So this idea of Jesus coming into Jerusalem on a donkey to fulfill this Zechariah prophecy, to prove that he was the Davidic Messiah, is legend. And Jesus himself states that that concept is false. So what was Zechariah really about? I cite this article from oxfordbibliographies.com. You see the link below. The book of Zechariah is set initially in 520 BCE, some 20 years after the first Jews returned from exile in Babylon to the region of Judah. Earlier prophets had promised the glorious restoration of the nation. However, the reality for those who returned fell far short of their expectations. Their endeavors to rebuild the city, the temple, and their community life were frustrated at many levels. Into this situation, the prophet Zechariah calls on the people to return to Yahweh. Zechariah is given 8 night visions that promise the restoration of the city of Jerusalem and the temple, the overthrow of hostile nations, the eradication of wickedness, and Yahweh's return to the people, along with a future Davidic king. A prophetic sign action reiterates several of these themes. 2 years after these visions, with the temple nearing completion, a delegation is sent to ask the leadership in Jerusalem whether fasting was still appropriate. Zechariah calls the people to pursue covenant faithfulness and to set their sights on the consummation of Yahweh's kingdom, when fasting will become feasting, and the nations will come to Jerusalem to share in this blessing. Zechariah 9:14 contains 2 oracles that dramatically portray Yahweh returning to his people and establishing his kingdom. These oracles depict a future battle at Jerusalem and explore what God's coming means from different perspectives. For the nations, God's people, those who are leaders, God's king, Jerusalem, and all creation. These chapters are undated, and they lack any direct reference to readily identifiable persons, including the prophet. So, Zechariah was prophesying in a time when people in the Babylonian exile were allowed to return to Jerusalem to reestablish their city, rebuild a second temple, and establish their Jewish community life. And in the end, what was expected to happen once that was established was that God would send an anointed king, a Messiah ben David, to reestablish and restore Israel in its wholeness, in its power and its beauty. So the writers of the Gospel of Mark and subsequent writers wrote the story in such a way that it seemed that Jesus was fulfilling this prophecy. But there's a problem. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus clearly states that he was not the Messiah ben David. So did Jesus fulfill Zechariah's prophecy? Mark 12:35-37. While Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said, "How can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, by the Holy Spirit, by the Ruach HaKodesh, declared, 'The Lord, Yahweh, said to my Lord, the Davidic Messiah, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.'" David himself calls the Davidic Messiah Lord. So how can he, the Davidic Messiah, be his son? And the large crowd was listening to him with delight. So the way that this is presented becomes really confusing. The Lord said to my Lord, and David calls him Lord, and how can he? You have to be able to see the original Hebrew of the psalm that Jesus is citing here. The Lord, meaning Yahweh, Adonai, said to my Lord, the Messiah ben David, to come, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies, all the enemies of Israel, under your feet. If King David calls the Messiah ben David Lord, how can the Messiah ben David be his son? Because no king would bow down to his son. The son is subservient to the father. This was how it was in regular Jewish families, that the son was subservient to the father. The father would not raise the son above himself. More so with royalty, right? King David was all-powerful. He would not call his son, somebody subordinate to him, Lord. So therefore, Jesus says that a Messiah ben David is illogical, irrelevant, and not true. So Jesus debunks the idea of a Davidic Messiah. If Jesus doesn't believe in a Davidic Messiah, therefore he would not self-identify as the Messiah ben David. Phrases like this, no church, no Orthodox church preaches this passage from Mark. Why? Because if people start asking questions, it actually destroys their whole dogma, including the idea of the second coming of Jesus as the Davidic Messiah. From a non-biased biblical scholarship point of view, any time that a phrase in a scripture seems to contradict everything else, that's viewed as highly probable, meaning probably historical. In other words, when these Gospels were being edited and added to and taken away from, oops! The Orthodox Christians left this one in there by accident. Just like the Orthodox Christians don't want people to think about reincarnation, when Jesus clearly says in every single one of the canonical Gospels that John the Baptist was Elijah. And nobody wants to preach those verses either, because it takes away the whole one life and you get heaven forever or hell forever, which is not true. So anytime you get these verses that seem to contradict dogma and doctrine of the Orthodox Church, you want to look at those very carefully. And again, Mark 12:35 through 37 clearly shows Jesus does not believe in a Davidic Messiah. So why are they trying to make him into the Davidic Messiah? So that they can sculpt a dogmatic doctrine and create a very powerful priesthood. Let's continue with the Liturgy of the Chalice.